Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our next lesson on the structures of the digestive system. We are going to get pretty specific now. So now we've talked about labeling the structures. Now we're going to talk about the difference between mechanical and chemical digestion. You've already been able to identify the structures. So now we're going to talk about the enzymes and the structures in more depth. And you're going to diagram how the movement of macromolecules move into the bloodstream or into the lymph glands. So we're starting in lesson 4 today, and we're going to start off in the mouth. So you've labeled this structure. So now let's talk about some key points. So the mouth has a neutral pH of about 7 to 8, and its role is to do both mechanical, meaning chewing and breaking food into smaller chunks, and chemical, meaning actually causing a change to the actual structure of the molecules. Those are both terms of digestion. So you're going to see mechanical and chemical show up a lot through this. Mechanical means to pull it apart but keep the structure as is. Think of like cutting your hair. If you cut your hair's still your hair. Okay, it just might be shorter. Chemical would mean like actually changing the structure of something, like when you mix vinegar and baking soda and you get that large reaction, that's a chemical reaction. All right. Now, in your body, your mouth secretes something called salivary amylase. So that's the next blank you have in your notes. And this immediately takes any polysaccharide you have eaten and breaks it down into a disaccharide. So to reiterate, your mouth is only digesting carbohydrates in chemical digestion. That's what the enzymes do, is chemical digestion. So the salivary amylase is breaking down polysaccharides immediately into disaccharides. Proteins and fats are not getting chemically digested, only mechanically digested. So what happens is that food is referred to a bolus, and that bolus enters into your esophagus. So that's the starting point of the mouth. Choose your food, but then chemically breaks down polysaccharides to disaccharides. Now, key facts about your esophagus: it's a tube that runs from your mouth down to your stomach, and as food travels, it uses gravity and something called peristalsis, which are muscular contractions. So peristalsis is the movement of pushing food down into your stomach. Now, it enters through something called the esophageal sphincter. It's a sphincter that sits right at the top of your stomach where your esophagus meets, and it is closed. So when food is coming down your esophagus, it relaxes and opens up. Now, food enters in and heads into your stomach. Now, this sphincter that I was just talking about prevents any acid from coming back from your stomach into your esophagus. So the contraction of the esophageal sphincter, so keeping it nice and closed, means that acid from your stomach can't splash up into your esophagus. Now, if it does happen, okay, where it is reaching from your stomach into your esophagus, we call this heartburn. Heartburn is usually occurring because the sphincter is not functioning properly, and so you're getting acid from your stomach into your esophagus, and it's actually burning your esophagus. Now, if we look at the location of our esophagus, it falls right in our chest area, most of it. That acid is being splashed up into this area, so we call it heartburn because it feels like our heart is on fire, but really it's our esophagus. So this is how the movement of food passes down from peristalsis. You'll see from your mouth, it stretches your esophagus, and your esophagus stretches back and pushes it to the next section. So that is peristaltic movement. Okay, it's the contraction of those muscles inside your esophagus. So here we're going to watch a little video on how that actually works. You can see it through an x-ray. So if someone is chewing food, which you're seeing this person doing, when they swallow it, you should see it moving down their esophagus. So you can see as it's being pushed down through their throat into the back of their esophagus, and you can kind of almost see the esophagus pinching as it goes through. So we're going to move into the stomach. The stomach has a pH of a 2. So this is the first blank you're going to fill in. It's a very, very, very low pH. Okay, so this has a pH of 2 because it's filled with acid. It's a J-shaped organ, and its job is both mechanical and chemical digestion. Okay, so the first thing it does is it does mechanical digestion. So mechanical digestion by churning the food. So peristalsis, that's your second blank. Peristalsis churns the food in the stomach, and we call that mechanical digestion. Okay, so our mouth does the chewing of the food for mechanical digestion. Our stomach mixes it up for mechanical digestion. Now, within your stomach, okay, you also have something called pepsin, which is an enzyme. So pepsin is produced in the stomach to break down proteins. This is the enzyme in your stomach. Now, we also have hydrochloric acid, okay, and I'm going to talk about that really quickly. Hydrochloric acid is in your stomach and is what we call stomach acid. Its job isn't to break down proteins chemically. It does it through mechanical digestion. So it's essentially ripping proteins into smaller pieces. Think of someone with really long hair getting their hair cut. That's HCl. It comes along and cuts the hair. Okay, it's just cutting the protein. Pepsin chemically changes the structure of a protein so it can be broken down. So pepsin is produced in the stomach and breaks down the proteins. Now this low pH that I was talking about, which is the HCl, is there to kill bacteria as well. We do not want bacteria in our food to make us sick. So the HCl is a really low pH so that we can kill that bacteria as it moves into our body. And lastly, we have something called the pyloric sphincter. So at the top, we had the esophageal sphincter. Down here, we have something called the pyloric sphincter. The pyloric sphincter's job is to control the movement of the food into the structure we call the duodenum. Now, the duodenum is a fancy name for the small intestine. It's the first part of the small intestine where almost all of digestion occurs. So in the small intestine, or the start of the small intestine, we call the duodenum, we have a channel, a common channel, okay, right at the beginning that gives liquids from the liver and the pancreas. So right at the duodenum is where the liver and the pancreas, through the pancreatic duct, drop a bunch of liquid into our duodenum, okay? So the common channel from the liver and the pancreas enters the duodenum, all right? Within the small intestine, you also have a ton of villi present. And this villi presence is very important because it increases surface area. Surface area increasing is important because all of this area here is going to help absorb the nutrients into your body. When we absorb nutrients into our body, we want to make sure that we are using as much surface area as possible so we can trap those glucose and amino acids and all of that into our bloodstream. So let's quickly talk about how that works. So here's our villi. Inside each villi is something called a lacteal. And what we're doing is talking about how we actually move those nutrients that are now broken down into your bloodstream. All right. So glucose, which has been broken down from a polysaccharide using amylase, and then we're going to talk about the other ones, carbohydrases, here in a second. Glucose is now floating around in your small intestine in the sections called ileum and jejunum. Now, what happens is glucose has to be actively transported into your actual cells or the lining of the intestinal wall. So glucose uses energy to enter into the intestinal wall, and then it gets transported into your bloodstream. It's very key, guys, that you know that glucose is actively transported to the bloodstream. And that's the blanks you have in your notes. When it comes to amino acids, which are proteins, proteins are digested first in the stomach using pepsin, then in the duodenum using peptidases, and we'll talk about those in a minute, and then amino acids are created and are floating around the jejunum and the ileum. These amino acids, again, are actively transported to the intestinal wall to the blood vessel, which is, again, very key. Make sure you have that in your notes. Glycerol and fatty acids or lipids are a very different story. So if we go back, and I'm going to go back over here, oops, wrong way. If we go back and look here, you're going to see this structure running up the center of the blood vessels. So here's our blood vessels inside your small intestine's villi. This thing right here is called a lacteal. So let's go back. A lacteal is part of what we would call the lymphatic system. So fats aren't actually transported into your blood. They are transported into the lacteals. So fatty acids and glycerols, which are the smallest form of lipids, a fat enters your body. It travels from your mouth down to your stomach into your small intestine, where bile covers this fat and moves it apart a little bit. So you'll notice all of these were together. The bile kind of separates them out a little bit. And then the enzyme of a pancreatic lipase comes in and gets breaking down these into glycerol and fatty acids. Those are then diffused across into your small intestinal wall, which they're reassembled. So we put them back into a triglyceride, and then they're moved into your lymph gland or your lymph vessels. So that's the story of the movement through the entire digestive system: mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestine. We have not talked about the role of the large intestine yet, but we will. I want to pause here and talk about some key extra structures. Food does not pass through these structures. It goes mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine. These next structures are just parts of where we get all of our enzymes from. So this is called the pancreas. Your pancreas attaches to your duodenum through the pancreatic duct. It is not passing food through it. It is just attached to your small intestine. So when food comes from your small stomach and enters into your duodenum, we need enzymes to digest it. We know this. Enzymes speed up reactions. So the pancreas delivers about 1 liter of fluid to the duodenum each day, and it produces all of these key enzymes. Pancreatic amylase, which is breaking down carbohydrates. Pancreatic lipase, which is breaking down fats. Trypsin and chymotrypsin, breaking down proteins, and nucleases, which are breaking down nucleotides, which we don't talk about in this chapter, but just so you know they're there, okay? These then contain things called sodium bicarbonate, also from the liver, from itself, sodium bicarbonate, to neutralize the chyme. So chyme is what we call the stuff coming from the stomach, and then its reasoning for that is to deactivate the hydrochloric acid. So this is just an extra structure that is utilized in the digestion story. No food passes through it. Now I'm going to jump back again because I want to finish off this story. So these guys right here, and we're going to talk a lot more about them here shortly, pancreatic amylase, trypsin and chymotrypsin are not the final enzymes for what actually gets broken down into glucose and amino acids. If we go back to the small intestine and to the surface, this structure right here, the small intestinal wall, okay, actually secretes enzymes itself. And so that's where we get carbohydrases, which take a disaccharide into a monosaccharide. And we get peptidases, dipeptides into amino acids. We get the final digestion coming from the small intestine itself. And we're going to talk about that in our next video. So the last two extra structures we're going to talk about are the liver and gallbladder. And I keep saying extra because they do not have food pass through them. Food goes mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestine. The liver, which is right here, and the gallbladder, which is right here, just give us stuff to help with digestion. So their job is to produce and store bile. Bile is the stuff that if you're really sick and you've been throwing up for days or you've been throwing up for a long time and there's nothing left in your stomach and you throw up and it's yellow and gross and it burns, that's bile. Bile's job is to go and emulsify the fats. Okay, so if we go back again, sorry for the back and forth, but if we go here, here's a fat, here's bile. Bile's job is to attach to the fat molecules so that we can kind of pull them apart. They're still a triglyceride, but we're just separating that triglyceride out a little bit so that bile can attach to it so we can actually get the enzymes in there to help break apart the triglyceride. So bile comes in, emulsifies the fats, making them smaller droplets rather than big ones, and increases the surface area. Okay, so bile salts are there to increase the surface area. And then when we do that, okay, in the pancreatic lipase, which is the enzyme for lipids, can actually do its job. So if we're thinking of emulsification, think oil and water. They don't mix. They shouldn't stay together. But if you shake it hard enough, you can make it look like they're mixing when really it's still oil and water. Bile is doing the same thing. It's creating what looks like a smaller version of fats, but it's still triglycerides. So the last part of our story is the large intestine. And the large intestine is playing a role in digestion. Mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, now to the large intestine. The large intestine's job is now everything is digested. We've absorbed all the nutrients we need. We need just to do a few last minute things. One is compacting and storing fecal matter. So anything our body does not want, anything our body cannot utilize, has to be defecated or has to be pooped out. So fecal matter is what that is. Now, the large intestine's main role, you guys, and most important role is absorbing water. If we did not have the large intestine, we would become extremely dehydrated. As fecal matter passes through, you have to think about what this is. We swallowed food, we mixed it with a bunch of fluids. 1 liter of fluid is released down into the small intestine. We drink water. Our fecal matter is like diarrhea, if you really think about it, okay? If we are not absorbing that water, we are going to get rid of it somehow. So the large intestine's job is to reabsorb that water. If someone has diarrhea, it's usually because there's an inflammation within their large intestine and they can't absorb that water back. So that's the first big main role. The second main role, which is really cool, is our large intestine is actually a place where we make or synthesize a ton of vitamins using a little bacteria called E. coli. Now, E. coli, if you think about it, if we eat it, could make us really, really sick if we eat it from another animal. But we actually naturally have E. coli in our guts. And what happens is it helps us make vitamins like B12 and potassium. So that's the second major role of the large intestine, is to make sure that we are actually producing vitamins. So that is the structures in a really quick roundabout way. We're going to go even deeper in understanding in our next video. So if you have any questions, please let me know.